What is the difference between employee and a independent contractor? Hi, this is Arash Shahriari, and tonight I'm gonna go through two steps to try to, number one, explain why this classification as the employee versus independent contractor is important and very detrimental, and number two, um, review the criteria that are in place to determine whether someone is considered an employee or an independent contractor. So, um, trying to make sense of why this is important to begin with is a very simple logic and common sense. That is, basically by misclassification of the employee versus an independent contractor, somebody's rights are going to be diminished here and somebody else would be enriched. It's a very simple thing. And for this reason, the Internal Revenue Service as well as the Department of Labor are very serious to assure that the employers are properly classifying their workers, and at the same time they assess a very hefty fines to the employers who fail to make this proper classification. So there are three entities here that are involved. One is the employer. Well, first start from you, the employee, the worker. The second would be the Internal Revenue Service, and the third would be the employer. So as the employee, as the worker, basically, if you're instead of being classified as employee, you're designated as a independent contractor. If anything happens at work and you get injured while working, you're not entitled to a workers' compensation. This is one major issue. The other issue is that speaking of the employment tax, which is 15.3%. When you're an employee of the company, this 15.3% would be broken down to half. Half is the responsibility of the employee, and half would be the responsibility of the employer. The amount would be basically 7.65%. When you're an independent contractor, you have to bear the entire amount. Your employer would not be paying for any of that. The third issue has to do with receiving certain benefits as part of your employment. For example, health insurance, life insurance, or some kind of a fringe benefits, generally speaking, like adoption credits or childcare allowance, things of that nature. You're banned from those potential benefits as well. Because of this misclassification, the other entity that really hurts here is the Internal Revenue Service and the Treasury of the United States. A lot of revenue is lost here because of this misclassification. Why? Number one is because of the FUTA or the unemployment taxes, which are responsibility of the employer only when they have employees. If the employer hires you as a independent contractor, they don't have to pay this. This is one piece of the massive loss of revenue for the Treasury Department. The second part would be the amount of the expenses that the deductions basically that the employer is entitled to as part of running a business, that would substantially reduce this. At the same time, there are a series of benefits as running a business that if you as a worker are not classified as an employee, the employer also can skip that and not pay employment tax at all on those things. So there's another major loss of revenue. Just imagine how many people they might do this, and they do this unfortunately enough throughout the year, cause a massive loss of revenue. So so far I think it's really established that why IRS and Treasury Department assess very high hefty penalties on people who unfortunately try to knowingly or not take advantage of the system. So I want to at this point review the it's 20 steps basically that they're not inclusive. That is, neither one of these alone can be detrimental on whether somebody's considered a worker is considered an employee or independent contractor. The combination of all these factors together will make the final classification on whether somebody's a worker is considered a employee versus an independent contractor. So as you're listening to this, I'm going to give examples, and just bear in mind that just one of them is not by itself a defining factor. So the first thing is level of the instructions given to the person. Where, how, and when. If the employer dictates to you basically where, when, and how to do your work, this is a benchmark that you're considered an employee. For example, if you're a truck driver and your employer dictates to you what routes to take, what hours do you have to work, and how you have to do it, basically. This is when you're considered an employee, no longer you're an independent contractor. What tools to use? If the employer tells you that these are the tools that you have to use, you're considered an employee. If the employee tells you where to purchase the supplies and tools, this shows also that you're an employee. If the employer dictates to you what specific task needs to be done, you're an employee then. I mean, typically when you're taking on a project as an independent contractor, the employer doesn't even know to begin with what needs to be done, and if they do, they're not going to engage and tell you what to do, what's going on. Speaking of that, just simple said, let me just point out to one thing. So one very informal way to really make an assessment right here is if basically the employer controls the work itself versus if the employer controls the result and the deadlines, things of that nature. So this is a simple way to think about speaking of this particular factor. So moving on, the degree of the instructions that are given to you. As more detailed these instructions are, this shows a more serious inclination to employee and employer relationship. Training. If the employer provides the worker with training, this shows that the employer has the intention to have the employee to perform the jobs in a particular manner. This shows a employee-employer relationship. So moving on, the amount of investment that you as the worker are putting into this. If you provide a lot of tools, for example, and in that same regards, your employer does not provide any, for example, this is one indication that you're actually an independent contractor. If there's so little obligation on you as the worker to provide your own tools, this shows that you're an employee. If you have any expenses while doing the work, if there are any amounts that you have to pay out of the pocket, this shows that you're an independent contractor. Whereas if you're an employee and there are expenses that you have to pay, but nonetheless the employer pays you back for them, they reimburse you, then again, this is more inclined towards the employee and employer relationship. Opportunity for profit or loss, that's another thing. If you as the worker your basically profit would be affected by how well the business is performing. That is, you have a potential for loss. You have a risk here. If you're an employee working for a company, you get an hourly wage no matter if tomorrow, let's say, the business goes bankrupt. If you're a independent contractor, likely how you do the work and your failure, if you can cause some omissions or error, it would affect how much you would be getting out of the work that you're doing for that employer. So whether you're able to offer your services to any other employers as well. When you're an employee, usually you have a schedule of time that you're working, and also you're dictated that there shouldn't be any competition, for example. So you're limited for the most part to stick to the same employer. When you're an independent contractor, speaking of a truck driver, and you're able to work for multiple people who are asking you to carry loads around here or there, you're an independent contractor. You're not an employee anymore. Method of payments. If you're paid an hourly wage, for example, you're considered an employee. If you're paid on a project basis, you're considered an independent contractor. Who gets paid? Say, for example, you're a truck driver, and the money that is collected from the client is given to you and you keep it, then you're an independent contractor. If the money you don't collect it in the first place, or if you do, it goes to the pocket, you have to turn it over to the employer, you're considered an employee. So that's another factor to consider. Number 14, this is very detrimental. I'm so sorry, I should have said this in the very beginning. And a written contract. Oftentimes I've had employers that I've talked to them, and they point out that, oh, you know what, from the first day we told this guy and he agreed. He said that he wanted to work as an independent contractor. In the eye of the court of law and also IRS, this is not an acceptable thing, simply because you guys made some arrangements between yourself that contradicts the law. It's not binding. It carries no weight, and unfortunately they don't really look at this. So employee benefits, if you're given some kind of fringe benefits as like childcare, parking, I don't know, cafeteria plan, health insurance, etc., you're an employee. If you don't have any of these things, you're an independent contractor. Permanency of relationship. If there's an expectation that you'll be working on a longer basis for that employer, you're an employee. When you're an independent contractor, you usually work per project. After the termination of the project, you guys will say bye to each other and you move on to another one. Unless there's a long-term project and is a hefty one, requires a lot of your time and resources. Typically independent contracts, as they move on per job to the next client of theirs. If the principal activity of the business is similar to the job that you do, for example, speaking of the truck driver, you're working for a transportation company. The main principal activity of this company is transportation, hauling things around. It's hard to, in this scenario, tell that you're just a independent contractor. You're in this, like I said, keep in mind, none of these things are inclusive. How do you say that? Just don't take one example, one factor, but alone, then again, if the primary activity of the company is what you do, there's an indication that you're considered an employee. The next item is if the employer presents the worker as the employee. Say if you go to some place that you have to do some work, and the employer has informed that person that he's my employee, he works for me, you know, stuff like that. That is an indication that your employee is well versus an independent contractor. So this kind of sums up the different factors that are utilized to try to come at the conclusion as whether somebody is considered a worker as an employee versus a independent contractor. I hope this was informative for you guys and was of value. If you liked it, please do like and comment. It would really be appreciated. If you have any questions, or if you need someone to make a determination for you, we can fill out the documents needed and submit it to the IRS so they can make the determination and accordingly reduce your tax liability that otherwise should have been shared with your employer, and other benefits that might have been like the fringe benefits as we mentioned that should have been you know, related to you. So take care of yourself and see you till the next time.